Good evening. My name is Amie Baca-Oelhert, and I am the president of the Colorado Education Association, the very proud president representing 39,000 educators across the state of Colorado. We represent teachers, nurses, psychologists, social workers, counselors, bus drivers, food service workers, paraprofessionals, all of the amazing educators who come together every single day to serve the students of Colorado, and who are continuing to do that. Now that we are in this remote or distance learning environment, we are seeing our educators just rise to the challenge like they do every single day. And at the CEA, while we are very focused on our new reality and everything that's happening, we also know that there are important things ahead, like election 2020. And it is important to stay focused on that and ensure that we are electing candidates that support public education, that support educators, and that support our students across Colorado. So at the CEA, we are very proud to be recommending Lisa Escárcega for for Congressional District 1, for the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education is a race that not all voters pay attention to, but as educators, it is one of the most important races that we can pay attention to as educators, and that really all voters should be paying attention to. We know that our public education system has tremendous impacts on our communities. We're seeing that right now, what our communities are going through because our schools are not in session. For many of our students, school is the place where they receive a warm meal each day. School is a place where they get access to health care. It is so important that we have elected officials who understand the complexities of a public education system. Lisa Escárcega is a lifelong educator. She knows what it's like to be in the education system. She knows what it's like to be an educator, to support educators, and mostly to support students and families across Colorado. We could not be more proud to have a candidate like Lisa Escárcega, who will be the voice for students, educators, and families across Colorado as the very important decisions are made at the state board level that impact all of us across Colorado, our students and families. So I am so proud to be supporting Lisa Escárcega for State Board of Education. I ask you all to join me in supporting Lisa, and I'm excited tonight to have an opportunity to hear from Lisa, have her answer some questions from everyone, and really just, again, bring this to the attention of everyone, as I know there's a lot on people's minds, but it is so important that we elect the right candidates to public office in 2020, and Lisa Escárcega is the candidate for State Board of Education in Congressional District 1.
Lisa, did you want to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Sure. So thank you, Amie. Very, very kind, very wonderful words. I've worked with CEA for many, many years, and so appreciate the leadership, because what we know in not just education, but across all sectors, leadership matters. So thank you, Amie, for your leadership. So I am Lisa Escárcega. I am running for State Board of Ed in Congressional District 1. My passion for public education started in my childhood when I was very young. My family experienced poverty, homelessness, and eventually I went into the foster care system. It was my neighborhood schools. It was always public school that lifted and supported me, my teachers, even my high school counselor who supported me and got me where I am today, which makes sense why I went into education. I was a school psychologist. That's where I started. I have worked in every level of education that there can be, from the classroom, as I always say, from the classroom to the boardroom, including with the Department of Ed, with the legislature, with university. I was a professor for a number of years. And it is just with that background and all that knowledge that I bring that I want to use to tackle some of the most difficult issues that we've been dealing with in our state over this past decade, and of course, even just over these past 10 weeks inside our system. So with that, I can turn it back to you.
Awesome, thank you. I'm Kristen Seibel, for anyone who doesn't know that. I'm Lisa's campaign manager, and I'm just going to kind of help run this on the back end. So that's why I'm here. If you go down to your bottom little bar there for your Zoom meeting, there is a way you could hit the Q&A and you can ask a question directly. You could go into the chat to ask questions. And there should also be an opportunity for you to raise your hand and stuff if you have a question, and then we'll be able to see all of that, and I'll be able to bring you guys on to go ahead and ask Lisa your questions. So it'll be really simple and easy in that manner, and we'll always have questions just kind of rolling in. So if anybody has a question, please go ahead and type it now while we wait for other people to type their questions. I'll go ahead and start with one that I know has been really on a lot of people's minds lately, especially, and it's around COVID-19. And just, we know that it's impacted this school year greatly. Anyone who came on early just heard us all talking. I have 2 kids. We just started remote learning today. What does that look like? What does it look like as a family? But we also know the impacts are going to go beyond the 2020, right? Like, we know they're going to go into next year. We know there's going to be financial impacts, learning impacts, the impacts of the testing, and, you know, all the things that are involved here. So what do you see as needs to happen to really be successful education-wise through the recovery of COVID-19?
Okay, yeah. So working in this right now, so between working with, you know, schools and districts and the governor's office, and I actually have 2 calls, in fact, one tomorrow with the federal office. The impacts of this are going to be far-reaching, and they're going to be much longer than people are going to want to admit to. So for instance, I know the governor who's actually speaking tonight, you know, when he had first said, talked about the waivers for accountability, and he said, well, we'll just waive them, testing for this year, this is all wonderful, next year we'll just get right back on that horse and we'll go. The impact of no testing, the impact of 2 months of 2.5 to 3 months of lost instruction on students is going to have an impact on everything for probably a couple years, right? And in fact, it may impact this generation of students for the beginning, the K-1-2 group, perhaps even to the time they graduate. What's going to be hard for people is to admit that and to say that they have to sit down and have these hard conversations, like there is going to be no growth data. You don't have a baseline from this year. You can't fudge and say, well, maybe we'll do it over 2 years. We'll kind of play that. You need to admit when things aren't going to be at the level that we need to, and then that's okay. We need to continue to have waivers. We need to continue to make exceptions, and we need to continue on with that in mind. People are going to be so ready to rush back and just want to say, let's just start up. The financial impact we have dealt with before, right? From 2008, we had the downturn, and we are already preparing for that portion of it. And hopefully that will actually be the least impactful. But I do think it is going to be having hard, honest conversations with folks and getting them, and you need the ground conversations, right? We need to talk with parents and teachers. Everybody's got to have their voice in this and not just push it aside because people want to get on. They want to get on with things, right? And the state board wants to move on. They have other things. So I think it's going to be really difficult.
Yeah, thank you for your honesty.
Yeah.
I agree. So Michael Neal had a great question, and he said, Lisa, how do we balance the need to use education for the workforce in areas such as STEM with the need to create creative, critical thinkers who know history, philosophy, ethics, media, etc.? So that's it. Just a quick look.
It is. And I think the pendulum, you know, that it really swung into college for all, and everybody was going to have this baseline. We wanted all kids to graduate, and I agree that it's an aspiring standard for kids. coming back and realizing now that we probably have swung too far away from workforce readiness at the same time, right? So we can produce great thinkers that can't work in a team, and we can produce people that can problem solve, but they can't manage the day-to-day kind of activities. Or maybe we've just worked so hard on one thing, but that's not the career choice for them. So I do see it, and people having conversations and having it kind of swing back to that middle of being more whole, well-rounded, and not so much focused in just one area or another. I think that brings us to graduation requirements for our state. And the work that's been done over just the past couple of years has been very much focused on college ready. We do have some other indicators now that are in there for career ready, and trying to figure out that balance is what the work that still needs to be done. And of course, districts have the authority to adopt their own graduation menu. And I think that that is a part of the state board's work also, is to share that out, work with all of the districts to give them the ideas, and especially even our rural districts, right? Because we do, as a state board, it's one of those interesting things. I represent Congressional District 1, and that are, my primary stakeholders, Denver, Englewood, Sheridan, and some of Jeffco. But every vote that the state board takes is a statewide vote that impacts 900,000 K-12 children. So just something to remember.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Anna Noble, and she's asking, what can we learn from this? And in this, I believe she's talking about just kind of the COVID-19 and the remote learning we're in. So what can we learn about the importance of brick and mortar schools and humans as teachers? In other words, what can we not do remotely? Give our parents a break, but I'm sure you have more beyond that.
Well, and I've raised 3 children, and they've done a little bit of online work themselves. I've seen it work for one and not the other 2. Particularly math seems to be a hard area to do online. I do think people, parents and teachers, now are going to have lots and lots of stories and hands-on experience to say, here is where, if you're going to do online, here are the things you need to do. And you're going to find a lot of people that realize this is not where their children's needs are best met. When we started online school, we had one in Aurora many years ago, went straight online when we first started. And it didn't take long before they realized that they really did need to have one-to-one interaction with the student. They needed to come in for a certain amount of time. And then they started calling it what they call it as a blended learning model. And I think even if you went straight online, blended learning is the way to go, that you need to have that interaction. So, and I think we've discovered there is a portion of students who can do okay online. They tend to be older, they tend to be more focused. And for the vast majority of students, though, straight online for like this just is not. Yeah, I can see you shaking your head. I don't know if everybody else can see me, but I see Kristen going like this. And I do think that this experience is going to bring a lot of voices. Parents, a lot of people can speak firsthand now about this. And I was talking to a Denver school board member today, and I said, if you had said 2 months ago, you know what, Denver is going to flip their district, and in 3 weeks you're going to have 100% of students online, I'd said never, ever going to happen. So what they say, what is it? Crisis is the mother of, necessity or invention or whatever that is. And I think we've done it, but yeah, we are going to have lots of good information coming from this.
So much.
And I do believe it's going to significantly impact what students walk in with next fall. And we are, as educators, we're already talking about that. How do we do some of the necessary remediation? Where do we have and build in the time to help support this? Even on a good day, this got rolled out so fast, we wouldn't expect it to be the best it could have been. So
absolutely. And then this just kind of piggybacks, we can see what's on everybody's mind, obviously what's most current. How do we best serve our special education in the midst of this crisis? How is that going to best be served? I am very eager to hear this. As a mom with a special ed kid, so.
Well, I think that our lack of resources here is what is playing out tremendously for our students with special needs. The things that we could or should be doing right now, we're just not able to do. I don't know. I mean, I think about this, and there's a parent that emails me a lot. She has a very high needs special ed student, or a student with special needs. And she's awesome with what the information she provides for me. And I'm trying to think, how could you, in a situation like this, where a caregiver, somebody, a support staff person, this child needs one-on-one support to go through any kind of learning. And if you can't have someone come in within 6 feet of them, they can't be in contact, how disruptive that has been. Of course, now that we've done this, we have some people coming up with ideas, but it's not in time, right? So we have this, now we have a dichotomy. We have folks that are asking for some waivers, right, from some of the IEP requirements and such, and I get that because of the unusualness of this instance. But then you also have parents and people, and myself included, you know, as an advocate back in special ed 30 years ago, starting before they were even IEPs, believe it or not. That's how old I am. Just fearful that any kind of leeway is going to be harmful. So I think districts, and I have talked with a lot of districts that are trying to figure this out and working on and focusing on it. Their first priority, honestly, was how do we feed our kids? And then how do we get computers? And now the biggest conversation I'm hearing every day is what do we do for our students with special needs? And depending upon the level of severity, there's just not an answer right now.
And yeah, special education is a very broad topic, for sure. Andrew Krisman, I hope I said his last name right, asks, what impacts, positive or negative, has the School Accountability Act had on the school system? And what changes or replacements would you advocate for?
That's good. So I've worked in this area probably for about 20 years, and I am a strong proponent of changing our current accountability system, that it has not served us or our students or our communities or our schools well. The idea of it went from school improvement, which is where we first started, right? How do we give information to our schools so that they can act on it and make it actionable information and then move forward and always be in improvement mode? That's where we originally came up. And instead, it became this hyper focus on testing and of comparison of schools, and then putting data into teacher evaluation and things like that, so that it just narrowed the focus. It narrowed away from all of the factors that we know make a quality school, like school safety, culture, teacher retention, teacher pay, parent involvement, course offerings, transportation, attendance, all these things that, you ask a parent, what are you looking for in a school for your child? Test scores often, if you look at the surveys, test scores often come in there somewhere, but they're not number one. And that's what we've done, is we've made it number one and really the focus of our accountability. So I want to, I'm working with Denver Public Schools right now. We're trying to decide whether we go and just say, fine, the state's got their system, we'll use it for what we have to for the federal and state rules. But for our district, what is it that we want to look at and measure that will give schools information to be on a continuous improvement model? And it's not easy to do, to come up with quick answers. We've got this break in a way, right? Because we don't have testing now and accountability we have this year off, that we're slowing this down and hoping that we have even more time. But I do believe that a process moving forward, much like what Massachusetts did, is you start with the question, you don't start with what data do you have, so you can, what can we put in there? You start with, what do you believe is a quality school? How do we measure that? Do we have the data? And if we don't, how can we get it? And that's a months long process. It just doesn't happen overnight. But I would love for the state and the state board to start having this conversation and not just listen to this typical smaller group of individuals. I'd like Denver to be a leader, and then hopefully the state jump off from that.
Awesome. Well, as a DPS mom, I wish Denver would be the leader too. We have another question here from an anonymous attendee. As a state board member, how are you going to ensure CDE staff, and CDE is Colorado Department of Education, is responsive to listening to actual practicing educators and not just district leaders? District leaders are part of the puzzle, but not always the most authentic voice to represent practicing educators. And I think that's a really great question.
It is a good question. I have over the last 20, 25 years, I have sat on probably 30 different state committees and coming through as a district person. But the reason why I keep getting asked back and doing it is because I have school experience and I understand. And they often ask me these questions. So how does this impact? How does this impact? Versus someone who's been just behind a desk, say, or has just done numbers and doesn't have the full picture. It's kind of funny. I've actually had personal conversations with the commissioner over the past decade, and I have talked to them about hiring. This was just way before state board, and just said that I would really like them to continue to strive to hire people from the field. And they had started doing that. I mean, we've seen some move over since this current commissioner has come in. And there are a few members there that have years and years of education experience. It's wonderful. But we still run into the roadblocks where too many of them don't. So hiring is where I would encourage the commissioner to continue down that road and really make that a preferred, if not required, piece before they hire people. And then second, when sometimes it gets legislated who sits on these committees, but they do have leeway generally to make sure that they have a broad voice. And it is when, honestly, it is when CEA and members and teachers and counselors and folks are on these committees that I feel they work the best. And so just encouraging the state board to continue, the commissioner to continue doing that. And then where we can get it in the rules even would help so that it would happen.
Awesome, thank you. And just to clarify, I think for you with CDE and the state board, can you go into what the relationship is with the CDE and the state board? Because it's an interesting dynamic.
It is, and it is much like, for anybody who comes from a district who has worked in schools, it's much like that setup where the primary hire of the state board is the commissioner. But they set up a plan and a policy or whatever it is, goals for the commissioner, just like they would a superintendent, any leader. And they say, you know, of course, here's where we want you to go. So they have a lot of influence on what the department does. The other big influence, of course, is the federal government, and there are federal regs because this Department of Ed, unlike school districts, they are a regulatory agency. And their job is to create regulation and to implement and see that they are followed. And they must follow, like especially around the big money that comes in, or what we call our title programs. Most of that money actually just comes and flows through the Department of Ed and then goes out to districts. But what they have to do as far as monitoring that money and all those things, that's pretty prescribed. So the department has grown quite a bit in the last decade into things that are not so regulated. And that's where the commissioner has a little more leeway in what they can direct the work to do. But that's basically the relationship. It is the leadership matters.
Yeah, great.
Yep.
Thank you so much. And just once again, for everybody on, if you want to make a comment, you could go into the chat or Q&A. There should also be a way for you to raise your hand, and then I could enable you to actually say your question. So anyway, but right now people are just typing them in, and I'll just keep reading them. But if you have any questions, feel free to go. Andy asks, our teachers are woefully underpaid. Absolutely. What can or will you do to fix that?
Okay. There's a bill out right now that we think probably isn't going to make it now because of the stop in the legislature. They are going to come back, but they're not going to do all the bills. There was a bill that I supported as far as creating a bucket of which we could put some funding in that would be solely dedicated to educator pay. The other big piece to that was the thought that we would have a ballot initiative on this fall. And we're still working right now with all of these groups. It is the Teachers Association, it's the Colorado Fiscal Institute, it's transportation, and it's water. It's a lot of us together in a room. It put together a ballot initiative looking at a graduated income tax where 95% of the people in our state would actually see a reduction in their state tax. And then for those making the top 5% of income, it would ratchet up. Any amount over $250,000, they would pay a little bit more on those higher amounts. That money, we believed if 50% of it was going to go into education, or would go into education if we get this. And it's things like that. I mean, the ballot, they seem big, but we are so underfunded in the state. We have made so many attempts. Amendment 73 I worked on. I actually worked on Amendment 23. That's when I started in this policy work, and was the treasurer actually for that committee until our governor came in and took over, and I didn't have the credentials. I didn't have that kind of clearance to do that work, but have been trying for that long to increase school funding. And we're starting to lean toward more of some of the policies that are directing monies directly to educator pay and not being, as we say, unapologetic about it. And I'm seeing more and more districts actually saying, yeah, we will do that. You give us the money, we will direct it to teacher pay. We get this, and it's impacting everything. So it's hopefully we're going to get this on the ballot, but of course now with the coronavirus, we can't collect signatures. That's where we're at right now, trying to work with the state Secretary of State's office to find out what we can do virtually. We might have to get legislation to allow us to do some of this, but be on the lookout for it. CEA is one of the big players in this, and more information coming.
All right, well, I'm excited to see that. This next one is a two-part question. With your background as a school psychologist, what will you do to support the strained mental health system? And that's the first part. And then the second part is, what will you do to improve teacher retention, particularly of Black and Brown educators? And how will you support the recruitment of Black and Brown educators, school psychologists, social workers, leadership, etc.?
Okay, so that's big. That's a big question. I think
I'll keep it up to go back if we need to.
That's all right. There is what I call on the state board, there's direct and there's indirect influence. And I think the direct influence that the board has might be in the area of grants. That's what they do now, and they get grants and they can put rules together. But I think for the state board, it's more of an indirect influence on how to work these things, and working with legislators when they're writing policy and advocating, even testifying. Occasionally state board members do that. As far as the need for these increased mental health supports, this is a sometimes Democrat-Republican issue. There's a lot of Republicans that feel like you even say social emotional learning and they go, oh, no. And it's like, oh, yes, we have to have this. And we need not only the resources for external, but we need resources for teachers to be supported as well inside the building. It's interesting, I was talking with some of the BOCES and some of the people across the state. And what we have started to talk about is increasing the mental health supports inside the system. And what we've forgotten is that the mental health supports in our community have also been greatly diminished. And that is a huge part of our problem. Maybe we need to advocate for both, not just to have more social workers and psychologists inside, but also in the community that can then have a partnership with us. And so I think it's more of, I think, an indirect influence on this, but having the background, like you said, I could speak to it. As far as the teacher pipeline, Representative Coleman had a bill that came through that I testified on in support of, that it's a study. I'm not a fan of studies, but it usually is a good first step to bring information forward to convince the rest of the legislature that there are solid steps forward that we can take on this. Dr. Bailey out of DPS did a study a long time ago, several years ago, on this very issue. And there are things, and it's more of a local board that can do these supports. And, even if when we do get teachers of color in the pipeline and we get them in the schools, we don't give them the support that they need. And pretty soon they're either moving or they're leaving. And I think I would love to see more numbers on this, on exactly where and how. I mean, that's usually a first good point of policy, is to get more information. And that's what Coleman's study does. But I think many of the answers lie within the individuals themselves, which is what I have found. And when I've been meeting with constituency groups and the caucus out of Denver Public Schools and out of the Denver Teachers Classroom Association, they have great ideas. And I think what I can do best is support what the people that are living this day to day say that they need. And that's where I would go with that.
Great. Thank you so much. And I didn't even have to reference the question again. Good memory. So literacy is still a huge problem in Colorado. We're still seeing enormous literacy gaps with our students. How can the state board support literacy and close these gaps in Colorado, especially with home rules and all of that jazz?
Yeah. So back in the day where it was, trying to think, it was CBLA, whatever that stands for, Colorado Basic Literacy Act first came in. I mean, that was the recognition. We'd seen it for some time that our early literacy scores are not where they need to be. Of course, across the nation, we had found that. There were attempts to mandate certain things, didn't work out. And so then the READ Act came in. And initially, again, I think that it wasn't quite on target, right? And a lot of people agreed with me that more about paperwork and more about plans and less about resources and supports and training. So we went back and rewrote this, the Colorado Basic, or the READ Act, and I was actually able to help write portions of it, along with a couple other folks, and Senator Nancy Todd, who is Senate Chair, brought that forward. Senator Rankin's wife, who is on the state board, is a strong proponent of this READ Act and of this bill. And so the idea is the bringing forward, starting with teacher prep, making sure that they have strong reading training, and including on the science of reading. I mean, back when I started as a school psychologist, I understood the reading wars, but there's been a lot of research in the last 30 years about how children learn to read. And we're just missing quite a bit of that. So having the teacher prep programs start off so teachers walk in at least their first year having some background of that. Then inside of it is also teacher training. What we advocated for was a little flexibility around the number of those hours, but what we've said was, and I very much said, if the training is not free and consistent and thorough, but free to all our educators, if you, CDE, can provide a free training, then we will do this, and CEA agreed. And so that kind of came through as well. We worked over the number of years in which you have to get the training, but then I think what is still missing is the supports for teachers. Once you're there and you can take a class, and I've done this, and you can take a class, but if you don't apply it, right? Professional learning, my dissertation was actually in the area of professional learning. So if you're not doing it job embedded, applying it every day and having continued supports, we probably still aren't going to see the success. So I think there's still a missing piece to that. The bill also does require curriculum that can show it's based on, it has science of reading inside based on that theory. It's for districts that are getting READ Act money, which is most districts. So we're kind of getting there. And I think we will see and have seen a few districts and schools that have improved pretty significantly. And I think it always helps other districts and schools to see where success is, and showcasing that, which is also a part of the bill actually, I believe will help. So it's going to take some time. And I think there are a lot of nervous educators. I would be too. We could tie this in with a change in our accountability system. Maybe that would help, and we could take some of that away and really give the space and time for people to get this right.
Great, thank you. So it seems that our current State Board of Education unanimously votes through waivers constantly for innovation and charter schools. How are you going to approach this differently? Because there's a lot of things in these waivers, and some have really huge impacts on teachers' lives, students' lives, and everything. So how are you going to approach waivers differently than how we see our current board approaching them?
Okay, so I've done some research. I have been for some time, and I've been talking with different attorneys as far as what can the state board do or not do when it comes to waivers. Because it seems like we hear this, well, it's, the schools give it to us, we have to approve them. And it's like, well, but if you have to, why do you have to vote on it then, right? It doesn't make sense to me. So there really are three different pieces of law that deal with waivers. One is just state statute around schools, and you can't waive the School Funding Act, so to speak. There's certain things you can't waive. But then there's also the Innovations Act, and then the Charter Schools Act. They don't always agree. But as far as I can tell, and what I've been able to see is that you can waive an individual waiver out of a whole stack for a school. You can't for a district. If a district says, I want to be an innovation district, you have to accept the whole plan. But for a school, you can not approve. You don't have to approve 100% of the waivers. And I've been working with a couple of the board members out of Denver Public Schools with this idea of looking at that approach. When I look at the waiver, so the state board set a rule that said that charters can have a certain number of automatic waivers. All you have to do is put it in your plan and say, I want these waivers, and they get them. And there's no effort to it. Just put it in there. A significant number of those waivers are around teacher employment. So it's teacher salary schedule, teacher workday. A few of these I can see if a school has a real unique model, maybe they don't want to follow the district, but teacher licensure is one of them. And that I don't get. So I'm thinking, this is me saying my support for educators, and especially around teacher licensure. I think this is going to be my place where I kind of like throw down the gauntlet and say, no, I'm not going to approve that waiver. And you are allowed to say the state board can not approve a waiver if they believe that it is in the best interest of the school, or if we believe that the school hasn't shown that it's really necessary in order to do its work, so to speak. So I'm going to investigate more, but I think that's a logical place to start. And one of the ones that I just can't see approving that unless I'm literally forced to, in which case I will come back and say, then why did I have to vote on it? Right? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And yeah, this will be good.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for taking such a strong stance on that. So here's a question from Carl. What do teachers and school leaders need to know about culturally and linguistically diverse students that would help improve these students' chances of greater learning success?
Wow. Okay, so that's that's 3 courses work of an answer there. I was a professor for Regis University, and I taught in the master's level endorsement course for ELD, teachers getting their ELD endorsement. And mine was a course around how do you know, and how do you monitor, and then how do you support a student with second language. And the question was, say it again, was the...
Let me pull it up. Sorry, I was being quick on my end. What do teachers and school leaders need to know about culturally and linguistically diverse students that would help improve these students' chances of greater learning success?
Okay, I was thinking policy versus practice, and I kind of got a little sidetracked in my head about policy, because I was a Title VII evaluator years ago. So it is a part of Denver Public Schools order that all teachers have to have a certain number of hours of training, and many of the districts in Aurora where I worked, we did the same thing. And it's a basic understanding of what a student walks in with, looking at them, and the second language is an asset, not a deficit. Working with their ELD teacher to understand how you can support language acquisition inside the classroom, right? There's a lot of models out there for that, whether it's in reading, doing pre-readings, or supports on the wall for words or whatever. SIAP model, they call that. There's a lot of that. And I think I find it works best when there's an ongoing coach and support in the building that can work. People assume all second language learners or English learners are alike, and they are as different as they can be. And so helping teachers understand how to know and understand the data you're getting is when they're first identified, at what level they are, at what level of acquisition they are, giving them some information about how language develops over time so they can understand how they can weave it into their supports. In addition to, then all students should have a dedicated ELD, we call it English Language Development time, that's independent of, in addition to all of the classwork that they have. So that's kind of a basics that cover that.
Great, thank you. And then here's just a question. How can schools better support first-generation college students? I was just listening to you talk about just all the different challenges with our English language learners, and I think that's true for our first-generation college students as well. And so how is it that our school system can be more supportive in this first generation going to college? You yourself was one of these students, yes. So I'm sure you have a lot of passion to say.
I do, and my husband is also a first generation high school graduate, and let alone college graduate. And we will both tell you that having significant individuals in our life that not only on a day-to-day support you, do your check-ins, but they explain and they take the time to really go through in depth what this is all about. I mean, I didn't hear the word college until I was 13. My parents didn't talk or know about it, and you need somebody who will not assume you have all that background knowledge and information. And it can be a counselor. It can be. Our counselors are so overworked, and many of them only have a chance to see a student maybe once a year. These are dedicated individuals who work with first-generation college students to support them in not only what courses do you need to take, how do you study. AVID program is a pretty good program that supports kids learning how to study. But then how do you apply? I mean, my high school counselor actually did this with me. My mother had no, she could help with the financial aid part, but she couldn't help with the college application part. There's just no understanding. It is very complicated. So I would advocate for having advocates, individuals who just do this work.
Thank you. That's awesome. So my next question is kind of a big one. It's about the school to prison pipeline. It's a real issue, particularly in DPS. So what can the state board do to start impacting this and stopping it and changing how we're moving forward?
Yeah. So I've given this a lot of thought, and I have been talking to Denver school board members about this as well. We have, I think, more visibility about this issue in Denver, although it is in other districts. It just has more visibility here, and I think Denver has had longer time to be thinking about it and to start working on it. There's two issues. One is data. So the state board does have access. Obviously, the state collects data around suspensions, expulsions, arrests, all of this. I actually oversaw one of those, or oversaw that data collection. And I understand there's a great deal of information that is collected. I think the state board could do a better job at asking the department to do a better job at monitoring the collection of that data, and then working with districts to keep that in their improvement plans, right? Because I'm not seeing it as much as it should be there. But so data first, that and then leading into policy. So when you, like one of the most recent pieces of legislation that came through was the K-3 suspension expulsion for reducing or eliminating that. And the first time that came through, there were a large number of groups that opposed it. And it wasn't that conceptually anybody thinks it's a good idea to suspend or expel a K through 3 student. It's not it at all. It's when the policy just says you won't do it, and you just won't do it, and there's nothing more to it. There needed to be more inside the policy to account for the fact that when you do these things at a state level, there's 178 school districts that have to follow this policy, this law, right? So we ran into concerns with our rural districts that said, yes, we're not Denver. We don't have a para that can work and sit with a child one-on-one if they ever need to be removed. We don't have a room where we can do an alternative to suspension program. We need a year or two to build up our personnel and to build up our resources to do this, right? So then once it came through, we all supported it. And I think we need to look at this policy at all stages. So you have the K through 3, which we know data says once you start and you have an expulsion or a suspension, the multiple suspensions then lead into more likely you're going to drop out, you're going to have interaction with the law enforcement, et cetera. Then you move into middle and high school. So talking with Denver quite a bit about this. And it's interesting because they've developed a model. They had this intergovernment agency agreement that was set to expire, that they ended up, this coronavirus stopped them from doing the work that they needed to see what was going to happen with that. But that was a start where they were acknowledging they needed to set some parameters around police law enforcement inside the schools. And I, talking with them, would encourage them to do more. In fact, I was asking, do you actually have a policy about the role of law enforcement inside your school? No, we have this intergovernment agency. Well, state of Washington did, the state did a policy, or basically a model policy that said every district is going to have one on how law enforcement is going to interact with students inside districts. And there's a great one that talks about, it very explicitly states out that things like they are the last resort ever to be called. The school leader is the one who is in charge of discipline. That training is a responsibility that has to happen. And it is the school leader that must make sure that that procedure, process, whatever, the use of law enforcement is correctly done inside the school, right? You can't just decide this child won't do what I want him to, I'm going to call the police. I think that that is another great next step for our state. If for us to do that, we don't want to say, and there was a bill recently that said, well, we'll give priorities to grants for schools or districts that are reducing their use of police. And we said that's not good. Reducing the use or defining more clearly the use of police is absolutely where to go. Making it ever harder for anybody to get a grant in this state in our fiscal situation, not good, right? So you kind of trying to, I'd like to see that brought back, but brought back in a different way here. Obviously, talking with educators inside buildings, even when you have a tiered system of here's what happens, it is so inconsistent is what I hear all the time. Inconsistent implementation, inconsistently followed, that I think we can do all the policy and practice, procedures, laws we want, but the school district is really going to have to take this on to monitor and see that consistency. We can do something perhaps even inside of our evaluation of the schools, right? When we talk about expanding what is a quality school, we can use some of this data perhaps to include in there, so it gives schools permission to have that focus versus just focusing on test scores. I mean, this is a big topic that we could talk about for quite a bit, but again, what I'm finding is that individuals that are doing the work have some of the best suggestions and need to be the ones heard in bringing this policy from the ground, from the parents and community up, and a little less top down.
That's great, thank you. And then this will be our last question. You've had pretty much a full hour of questions coming at you, and not all easy ones, so thank you. So your current job, you represent the state of districts across the state. You represent executives across the state, which means you are spending a lot of time looking at rural Colorado and, city and suburban and all of these different areas. So how are you going to shift gears and represent the people of CD1? And if you just want to speak a little bit towards that, that'd be awesome.
That is great. Well, what I bring to this role is my experience of dealing with the people across and the educators across 178 districts, across size school districts from 100,000 in size to, I think our smallest might be 50. The ability to work with those individuals, bring them together, get them to coalesce, and just be that collaborative listener and then worker. That's exactly what I bring now to CD1. I don't think we have 178 advocacy groups, but I could be that many in Denver. I've met with many of them. So many are on the same page as far as what they want for outcomes. They may not see it the same way as how to get there, but that's probably some of the parts of my job that I have enjoyed most, is working with folks from very different views, getting to know each of them and understanding where they're coming from. And maybe it's the psychologist in me, but really it is something that I do enjoy and have been quite successful at, and will do here for the entire population of CD1.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are pretty much at the end of our time. So if you just want to kind of have a few closing remarks and to say goodbye and thank everybody for their time this evening.
You bet. So this is, I'm glad that you all joined. This is a very important race for our state and for CD1. We have the state board is partisan, as you know, And so I am running as a Democrat. I am running on my record, my years of experience, my ability to develop strong working relationships, and that allow me to have those hard conversations that I think we have to have in order to make change here in CD1 and in our entire state education system. So I am thrilled for this opportunity. Thank you, Kristen. And I am reachable. I wish I used to get out. Don't get out so much anymore, but as soon as they let me, I'm back to meeting with people, but always reachable by email, phone, Facebook, any of those avenues until we get through this coronavirus.